Thank you. Well, I'm not going to hang over your head without trying to give some ideas about what we can do to make the world safer. So in the previous discussions today and yesterday, we have been dealing with a lot of issues related to complex adaptive systems and complex adaptive networks. And the properties in this disparate class of complex systems involve that they're composed of parts that are connected in some form of structured network. They exhibit various forms of self-organization. That is, the parts inside these systems are adapting and responding to each other and the exogenous inputs. Quite often this produces strong correlations, even though they might be independent, there are emergent behaviors. Some of that means that we have distributed control. It's rare for these complex adaptive systems to have a centralized control. And a very generic property is that they show chaos, sensitive dependence on initial conditions, but quite often make them behave in very different ways. They have a vast repertoire of ways to respond to an input and can respond to the same input in different ways depending on the internal state. And there are quite often various forms of emergent orders. One can, of course, go into a long talk just about what distinguishes different kinds of systems from each other. But let's just generically note that this talk is about what happens when we try to govern these complex adaptive systems, and especially the networked ones, whether that is a river and trying to control flooding, or the situation in a war-torn country, or an ecosystem. Now, global catastrophic risks and most disasters show elements that are complex adaptive networks. Homer Dixon et al. Did this interesting model of synchronous failure, where they demonstrated that you can have both a system under pressure, that hence different parts become correlated with each other. Then you get cascading effects across the system. And then as a final insult to the injury, you also get multiplicative effects when various bad things happen at the same time. And of course, we have already several times been mentioning this interesting issue of how a relatively simple volcanic event can cause a cascade of various impacts on various human systems that can then snowball into worse outcomes. And when we think about, of course, the example du jour, the COVID pandemic, we find that there is a fundamental core system, essentially viruses replicating in different bodies, that has a network effect because of spread among the people in their social network. But we also have these nonlinear interactions with the healthcare system. The healthcare system acts to inhibit the pandemic, but the pandemic is also wearing out the healthcare system. And both of them are affected by a governance system that is trying to handle this. And that governance system in turn is affected by other systems. So this sketch I have is just a small example of how you might map out the causal interactions in the COVID pandemic. Now, the interesting thing here is that there have been many attempts at describing governance principles for global catastrophic risks, and many of them are very abstract. There are also this increasing recognition that when you add a governance structure to try to govern a complex adaptive system like a pandemic, you're adding another complex adaptive system full of people, full of reflexivity, full of updating connections depending on what political and economical opportunities are exhibited. That is now acting on the other system. So we're ending up with an even more complex system. And it turns out that quite a lot of the governance structures we're having are obviously unsuited for this. So what Len Fisher and me did was we were trying to look for necessary conditions for effective governance. And many of them are fairly self-evident. So one of them is that the traditional goals of certainty and control are not achievable in a complex adaptive network, simply because you can't get all the information necessary to do a good regulator, and you will be having a system that is changing. You need to actually use some other methods to govern this. And that is typically a form of flexible, rapid decision-making process. Again, we might imagine using something like Ashby's law of requisite variety, having a governance system that totally understands what it's governing. But because of reflexivity, since the pandemic is in some sense responding to what the governance is doing, this is going to be problematic. Indeed, we can use heuristics instead. We can use fast reaction that are not perfect, but can handle the lack of information and uncertainty. Also, because of the distributed nature of this, you actually need integrated monitoring and action. You actually need to have nodes inside the network that can act. It's not possible always to affect this system from above or from the outside. Also, very obviously, that is going to require cooperation and coordination, both on an individual level, on a national level, and an international level. Again, COVID gives a good example of how this can both help and hinder when it fails. And finally, we need to invest in resilience and preparedness. In the paper, we outline this in way more detail. You might say all these things are truisms. They're kind of obvious, but very interesting because if even one of them is lacking, it's pretty clear that we are not going to be able to respond in any adequate way to the complex dynamical system, and even less to the unfolding global risk. So to conclude here, there have been many proposed governance solutions to handle risks, and we compare them to the various conditions and found that many of them miss them. But there are also some that actually do have full coverage. And it looks like you could probably repair some of the ones that are imperfect. There are ways of including the elements we identified in the paper. So the final question in the final 20 seconds is, so what? Well, these are not sufficient principles. Maybe that's not even possible in general to find. But certainly, if we can't achieve the necessary conditions, we're not going to succeed in the governance. Also, the really interesting question, and that's what Len and me are trying to work on now, is can we find enabling conditions, how to move from our current systems of governance to new systems of governance that can fulfill this well. And that way, give us a better chance to handle complex global catastrophic disasters. Thank you.
Again, 7 minutes almost on the dot. It's remarkable stuff. Okay, questions from the room. Any immediate thoughts? Yeah, at the back there.
Thank you for a really interesting talk. I was wondering, you had a lot of obviously discussion about the effectiveness of governance, and you outlined some conditions that might make governance more effective in this context. You didn't mention any kind of normative terms like legitimacy or accountability. So I was wondering if you had anything to say about possible trade-offs between accountability and other kind of normative ideas and the effectiveness conditions that you're interested in.
I think the normative aspects do show up when we try to achieve cooperation. Usually cooperation requires that you trust the other agents, that you think that this is a legitimate endeavor, etc. So they come in enabling the cooperation. But this framework is still rather abstract. We're mostly thinking in terms of systems dynamics, what interactions are happening in a system in the abstract, rather than going into the really important thing of how do I actually tell the people to do the right thing? What information do I need to send? So that is the next layer over. And I think this might actually be where we get into the enabling conditions. Because I do think that if you don't have a legitimate way of enabling this, then it's not going to get enabled. So I do think that is almost the next step. But that's going to be a talk for next year, hopefully.
We hope so. Other questions in the room? Otherwise, I guess I'll just abuse my privilege and say I was reminded during your talk of Adam Tooze's concept of a polycrisis, that we're facing this kind of multi-headed, self-reinforcing crisis at the moment of COVID, inflation, and so on. And his view of global governance for like most of the 20th century, but especially over the last 10 years, as being kind of just continued crisis management, and the governance kind of emerges out of our responses to crises. And I was kind of wondering if you had any reflections on that, thoughts on that.
I think the polycrisis concept is really useful because many of the different boxes I had in my diagram for the COVID pandemic are, of course, boxes shared by other disasters or ongoing problems. Populism is maybe also best seen as something happening about our epistemic system and lack of political legitimacy and some generational shift in society. But here it overlaps with the responses to a particular virus, etc. And it seems like if you want to have governance to deal with these things, you're going to have to distribute it, and it needs to be trying to handle everything at once. In order to do that, it also needs to, in some sense, be distributed. No single prime minister or expert can handle all the different crises. However, you might have several ones that are interacting, again, in an adaptive network to try to give each other effective support.